Look at the dry, sun-baked dust beneath your boots in modern-day Hilla, Iraq. It feels like ordinary desert dirt blowing aimlessly in the wind. But scrape just a few inches below the surface and you hit the shattered clay of an ancient superpower. This is not just barren earth. You are standing directly on top of a buried metropolis that once dictated the fate of 200,000 living souls. When you hear the name Babylon, you probably picture the legendary architectural wonders or the monumental walls. But what if its true greatness was not built from bricks, but from an invisible operating system of absolute control? Today, we are not walking through this 2,600 years of silence as mere tourists. We are going to dissect the brutal, brilliant machine that engineered human destiny and chained the forces of nature itself. After 2,600 years of silence beneath Hilla province, what truly made this Mesopotamian giant the center of the world? Was it simply the massive clay ziggurats, or the blinding blue walls of the Ishtar Gate? Or was there an unseen grip, a strict way of managing the Euphrates floodwaters and tens of thousands of laborers that actually kept the city breathing? We are not going to stroll through the dirt like casual tourists. By combining modern archaeological data with advanced digital reconstruction, we will step right into the ancient mud to see exactly how this empire controlled everything it touched. Before we begin, please note that all the images and video footage in this episode were brought to life using artificial intelligence. However, every single detail has been meticulously researched and verified against trusted historical sources. We promise there are no wild fabrications here. If this is your first time watching, or if you have been here before but forgot to subscribe, please take a second to hit that like and subscribe button so you will not miss our next journey. Leave the shadow of the Great Ziggurat behind and travel downriver. You are now standing knee-deep in the sprawling, watery expanse of the southern marshes of Iraq. The sharp smell of wet silt and decaying vegetation fills the heavy air. The midday sun is absolutely merciless, baking the landscape at a blistering 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Down here, you will not find a single glazed stone, a paved road, or a golden statue. You will only hear the low, endless rustle of wind tearing through thick forests of green stalks. This is the world of the Medan people, the original marsh dwellers. While the wealthy elite in the city center obsessed over rigid, eternal monuments, the families living at the bottom of society engineered a completely different way to survive. They turned to the giant 10-foot-tall reeds growing wild along the banks of the Euphrates. Watch closely as a local family gathers these thick green stalks from the muddy water. They do not bake them in blazing kilns or carve them with metal tools. Instead, they tightly bind them into massive bundles, sometimes 2 feet thick, using ropes twisted from the very same plant. With raw physical strength, the builders plant these heavy bundles deep into the wet earth and bend the tops inward. When tied together, they form a massive, sweeping parabolic structure. This is not a flimsy, temporary shelter thrown together for the night. It is a mudif, a sprawling communal guest hall that can stretch over 60 feet long and 20 feet high. If you walk into a museum today and examine the 5,000-year-old reliefs carved by Sumerian hands, you will recognize this exact same arched design. The building method has not changed over millennia, simply because it does not need to. Step inside the mudif. The physical relief from the scorching sun is immediate. Beneath the woven roof, it is entirely shaded and surprisingly cool. The thick reed walls act like a living, breathing lung for the people inside. As the hot desert air pushes through the tiny gaps between the dried stalks, it naturally accelerates and drops in temperature. It works as an ancient air conditioner, running entirely on the river breeze. When a severe seasonal flood hits, the Mudif does not crack or shatter like a rigid brick wall. The flexible arches simply bend and sway with the violent weather, absorbing the shock of the rising water. The ancient emperors tried to conquer the earth by stamping their royal names into heavy clay. Their palaces eventually fractured, dried out, and collapsed into the desert floor. But the marsh dwellers endured by flowing alongside the landscape. This profound resilience faced its ultimate test much later in history. During the severe political conflicts of the 1990s in Iraq, the ruling government systematically drained these ancient wetlands, turning lush green marshes into cracked, lifeless salt flats. Yet the knowledge of the reeds refused to die. The moment the water finally returned decades later, the locals immediately wove their arched halls back into existence, exactly as they did thousands of years ago. Walk away from the blinding light of the riverbanks and step into the heavy, cool shadows of the temples of Marduk archives. The air in this long, narrow room smells of cedarwood and damp dust. You do not hear the chaotic shouting of the merchants outside, nor the harsh cracking of whips from the construction sites. Instead, there is only the sharp, repetitive click, click, click of carved wood biting into wet earth. Look over the shoulder of the man sitting cross-legged on the floor. He is pressing a wedge-shaped scribe stylus into a fresh slab of mud. He is not writing epic poetry about the gods or recording glorious military victories. He is pressing cuneiform tablets into existence to track exactly who owes what to whom. This silent room is the true heart that forces the ancient metropolis to keep moving. Look closely at the thousands of palm-sized blocks of dirt neatly stacked on the wooden shelves rising to the ceiling. These tiny marks hold significantly more power over a human life than the bronze spears of the royal guards. Dating back to the rigid laws established during the Earth III period, the financial rules carved into these rooms are entirely ruthless. If a local farmer's crops fail due to a short drought and he needs grain simply to feed his children through the winter, he must borrow from the wealthy elite. The standard interest rate is a staggering 33% interest for barley. If an ambitious trader needs hard currency to buy copper ore from the distant northern mountains, the exact rate is 20% for silver. These are not generous numbers meant to help a desperate man climb out of temporary poverty. They are heavy weights deliberately designed to tie him down to the dirt he works. Watch the exhausted, sunburnt farmer standing nervously before the scribe's low wooden desk. He cannot read a single one of the wedge-shaped marks pressed into the mud, but he knows exactly what they represent. To finalize this dangerous loan, the farmer does not sign his name with ink. He reaches for a small, meticulously carved stone tube he wears on a string around his neck. He takes this cylinder seal and rolls it firmly across the wet clay. It leaves a unique, unbroken picture of a hunter or a sacred animal, his personal, undeniable identity permanently stamped into the dirt. In that exact second, his fate is sealed. The moment the clay dries and hardens in the harsh Mesopotamian heat, the debt becomes an unchangeable physical reality. It cannot be argued, it cannot be burned, and it will never be forgotten. The true, terrifying weight of this clay falls heavily when the harvest fails for a second consecutive year. With the 33% interest rate compounding on his initial barley loan, the debt rapidly grows larger than the total physical value of his entire farm. The hardened numbers on the cuneiform tablet demand absolute payment. When the grain silos are entirely empty, the farmer must hand over his remaining goats. When the livestock is gone, he gives up the legal rights to his ancestral land. Finally, when there is absolutely nothing left of physical value to trade, he gives himself. He, his wife, and his young children legally entered debt bondage. They become the temporary property of the creditor, forced to work the very dirt fields they used to own just to pay off the crushing interest of a mud-baked contract. The rulers did not need to build massive stone prisons to control the working population. They used the absolute precision of early mathematics and the simple mud pulled from the riverbed to freeze a man's destiny forever. Walk away from the scribes' dusty archives and stand before the towering entrance of the inner city. If you travel to the Pergamum Museum in Berlin today, you can stare directly at the reconstructed glazed blue bricks of the Ishtar Gate. It is designed to be a blinding, flawless display of supreme wealth radiating under the harsh midday sun. But look closely at the exhausted men and women being marched in heavy bronze chains beneath those glowing yellow lions and white dragons. These are the thousands of captives written about in the Old Testament, dragged hundreds of miles across the unforgiving desert after the brutal siege of Jerusalem. To them, this blinding blue architecture is not a beautiful wonder of the world. It is a massive, decorated cage specifically engineered to crush their spirit. Sit with these captives in the dirt by the muddy, slow-moving banks of the Euphrates as evening approaches. They hang their wooden harps on the willow trees, weeping as they remember the cool stone hills of Zion. The empire's royal architects desperately want these foreign prisoners to feel incredibly small, completely swallowed by the endless streets paved with imported red breccia stone. Every towering brick wall, every massive granary, and every golden shrine broadcasts a single, terrifying message. The king's military authority stretches relentlessly from the eastern shores of the Mediterranean Sea all the way down to the warm, salty waters of the Persian Gulf. There is nowhere left to hide, nowhere left to run, and the grand city appears utterly invincible to the naked eye. But the captives' despair blinds them to a slow, creeping disaster happening right beneath their bruised feet. The royal engineers, arrogant enough to build the Ishtar Gate, believe they have permanently conquered the violent river with a massive, rigid web of artificial trenches. They are entirely wrong. The muddy water of the Euphrates naturally carries millions of tons of heavy, suspended dirt down from the distant northern mountains. As the river slows down inside the flat, man-made ditches, that dirt drops heavily to the bottom, causing the severe siltation of canals. To keep the life-saving water flowing to the fields, an army of thousands of laborers must constantly dig out the wet, heavy mud by hand, day after day, under the blazing 110-degree sun. It is an exhausting, losing battle against simple gravity and endless dirt. Worse than the choking mud is what the river water secretly leaves behind in the soil itself. The hot Mesopotamian sun evaporates the shallow floodwaters at an incredibly rapid pace, baking a microscopic, invisible layer of white minerals directly into the dirt. Walk out to the edges of the vast agricultural fields just beyond the outer city walls. They are not lush and green. They are shimmering with a deadly, hard crust of white salt. During the earlier eras, around 2400 BC, the local farmers could easily grow sensitive, high-value crops to feed the growing urban population, but the relentless salinization of the soil slowly poisoned the earth. Over the centuries, the local wheat yield plummeted completely to zero, forcing the desperate population to rely entirely on hardy, salt-tolerant barley just to survive the winter. Eventually, even the tough barley yield collapsed, dropping so low that the farmers could not harvest enough calories to feed the canal diggers. When the workers starved, the canals choked with mud, and the water stopped flowing entirely. The grand, terrifying empire did not actually fall because a foreign army suddenly brought sharper bronze swords to the painted gates of Babylon. The glittering metropolis simply starved itself to death from the ground up. King Nebuchadnezzar and his successors spent their silver building taller monuments to intimidate foreign prisoners, while the very dirt that gave them life turned into a toxic white desert. The spectacular, perfectly preserved walls standing in the Pergamon Museum, Berlin today are nothing but a beautiful, fragile mirage. The empire was fundamentally destroyed by the relentless, quiet accumulation of ordinary salt. The slow, agonizing death by salt was only the first chapter of the end. When the heavily armed troops of Cyrus of Persia finally marched through the shallow, drying canals in 539 BC, they barely had to lift their bronze swords. They simply walked through the painted gates because the mighty city was already hollowed out, starving from the inside. A few centuries later, the unstoppable conqueror Alexander the Great marched his Greek armies into the city, desperately trying to revive this decaying giant as the capital of his new world. Instead, he caught a sudden fever and died in one of its damp, crumbling palaces at the age of 32. But the ultimate insult to these ancient, sun-baked bricks did not happen at the hands of ancient kings. Fast forward thousands of years to the intense, choking heat of the United States military's 2003 invasion of Iraq. In a rush to secure the region, military contractors built a massive helicopter base directly on top of the unexcavated ruins. Heavy combat tanks weighing 70 tons rolled carelessly over the fragile dirt. Soldiers filled thousands of modern canvas sandbags using the 2,500-year-old archaeological soil, crushing irreplaceable ancient pottery fragments under their heavy combat boots. So where is the true, untouchable glory of this empire today? It is no longer baking under the harsh Mesopotamian sun. It is scattered in thousands of pieces, sitting quietly behind thick, climate-controlled glass in foreign capital cities. The towering, terrifying blue lions that once guarded the dusty banks of the Euphrates no longer roar in the desert. They have been perfectly reassembled, brick by brick, inside Berlin's Pergamon Museum. If you want to read the exact, unforgiving laws that governed those starving canal diggers and desperate farmers, you cannot find them in the cracked earth of the Middle East. You must buy a ticket and travel to the Louvre Museum in Paris. There you can stare directly at the towering black basalt pillar known as the Code of Hammurabi, safely illuminated by gentle artificial spotlights. During the 19th and 20th centuries, European archaeologists aggressively pulled their sacred stones out of the mud, loaded them onto ships, and locked them inside pristine exhibition halls thousands of miles away. This creates a deeply uncomfortable reality. Does freezing a broken monument under strict security cameras truly save its historical soul? Or does it merely turn a once living, breathing city into an imported, lifeless trophy? Yet, if you look closely, the most resilient parts of this ancient superpower were never actually made of mud, salt, or black basalt. The physical architecture failed, but the empire survived by dissolving completely into the daily, invisible habits of the modern human mind. Every single time you glance at your smartphone to check a train schedule or set a morning alarm, you are unknowingly obeying the strict math of their ancient scribes. The stargazers of the empire mapped the night sky using a highly specific base 60 system to track planetary movements and predict the chaotic seasonal river floods. We simply took their wet clay mathematics and hardwired it directly into our modern digital screens. That is exactly why you still slice your fragile life into 60-second minutes and 60-minute hours. every time a modern pilot navigates a commercial jet using a precise 360-degree circle, or a tired office worker counts down the final exhausting hours of a 7-day week, they are breathing fresh life back into the ghost of the ancient metropolis. The massive, decorated physical walls eventually collapsed into worthless salty dirt, but their invisible mathematics quietly conquered the entire globe. You do not need to walk through a quiet, polished museum in Europe to find the lasting remnants of this lost, ruthless world. You just have to look at the ticking watch securely fastened to your own wrist. But this mathematical survival still leaves us with a difficult, entirely unresolved debate about the physical pieces we dug out of the sand. The grand, colorful gates and the heavy, carved legal statues remain permanently locked away in London, Paris, and Berlin, while the original dirt they came from continues to erode under military tank tracks and harsh desert winds. If the true value of history is understanding exactly where we came from and how we survived, who actually owns the right to hold these ancient stones? Should the magnificent blue bricks stay safe, clean, and polished in Berlin, or do they rightfully belong back in the harsh, salty dust of modern Iraq where they were first born?